Good morning, church. Hope you had a good week. As always, it's wonderful to be in the house of the Lord. For this morning's message, we'll be diving into Matthew chapter 20. So in your Bibles, let's go to Matthew chapter 20. And we'll read from verse 29 to verse 34. Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, verse 29 to 34. I'm sure it's a story you've read before, but we're going to go through it again. Matthew 20, verse 29 to 34. And as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him, and behold, there were two blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." But the crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. But then they cried out all the more. They cried, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And Jesus stopped and called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Then they said to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And then Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes and immediately recovered their sight, and they followed him. It's a story about two blind men. And we're told that, they're sitting by the roadside and all of a sudden they have an encounter with Jesus. And when you think of, the life of somebody who is blind, in the context of the story that we, read here, we know that their lives, were not like yours and mine. They didn't have the independence that you and I have. They didn't have means of income, that you and I have. They didn't have, a place to stay. They didn't have food to eat. And so it was the kind of life that nobody wanted. But despite the kind of misery they had in their life, there was something that they did which changed the course of their life. Something they did that just changed their lives. And that something they did is actually something that the world considers to be weak. That something they did is considered to be powerless and helpless often by the world. You know what they did? Verse 30, it says in 3 words, they cried out. They cried out. Those 3 words describe how their lives were changed. Today I'm just going to talk about the power of crying to Christ. The power of crying to Christ. Before we, dive deeper into the story, let's just take a moment to reflect on crying itself. It's something we've all experienced. We've all, cried at different points in lives. As children, we cried, and also, we've all had moments of sorrow or heartbreak, tears of joy. So we all know what it's like to shed tears, whether it's in private or in public, because crying is part of being human. It's a universal reality, and that's why even science has, explored the expression of crying. A lot of researchers have uncovered, some fascinating insights, into the expression of crying. For example, I don't know if you know this, but the pattern of crying is different in different culture. You know that? All newborns cry the same way, according to the study. But after that, how you cry is conditioned, by where you grow up. It's conditioned by the culture that you live in. So, they found out that the pattern of crying or the tone or the melody, in which you cry is conditioned by your social context. It's like the linguistic differences. It could be quite subtle, but it's quite fascinating, to think that you would probably cry differently if you were born in a different country. Right? Here's another one. Wealth is completely irrelevant. Because a study says that women in wealthier Western economies cry much more than women in poorer countries where women have fewer rights. And this is according to Dr. Ad Wingerowitz, clinical psychology professor. Another one, crying is contagious like laughter. When you see somebody laugh, it just automatically makes you laugh. It's contagious. And crying is the same way too. I remember, for my school farewell, I was so prepared to not cry. But then I just knew it in my heart. If I saw my friend cry, I would just cry. And how many of you cried, for your school farewell as well? Okay, I'm sure all of you cried. All of you cried. Or you felt a little bit, you felt sad, to an extent. But at least I'm the kind of person, if I see somebody cry, I can tear up pretty easily. So, just like laughter, crying is also contagious. You may cry just by seeing somebody cry, especially if you know that person really well. It's also discovered that in medieval times, crying was considered manly. So, if you saw somebody, on the road, maybe a grown man cry, you just think what a manly, guy it is, which is so different to the way we think now, because now the world says it's not manly to cry, but that's rubbish. But back then it was considered manly, to cry. It was an expression of manhood, apparently. It's also observed that women cry more than men. I'm so sorry to raise this point, but but apparently it's true, and I didn't come up with this. It's just a fact out there. Women cry more than men, and not just that, but women cry longer than men when they do cry. On average, it's observed that, women cry almost 7 times more than men. Wow, 7 times. Actually, it's true. It's true in my house also. Janet is so quick to cry, especially when we pray together. Sometimes I don't even have to start the prayer. I just have to say, Lord, and that's it. The tap opens. And the motor runs for half an hour at least, She's very quick to cry, and, you guys know that as well. That's a fun fact. And also, kids cry for problems which are not real. We know that's true. Right? Kids cry for problems which are not really problems. We've done that too as children. I remember as a kid, I was really scared of the barber. So my dad would take me to the barber shop, and it would just really scare me. Because, this idea of seeing a stranger, holding a blade and smiling at me, it is just terrifying, to a kid. And what hurt me the most is that my own dad took me there. That's what hurt me the most. I'm like, how can you do this to me, So I used to cry. I used to cry at the barber shop all the time. Now I'm recovered from that. Now I don't have that problem. But, with all that said, crying is, a God-given design, to express what's in the heart. Crying is done to release what's in the heart. It is said that a tear is made of 1% water and 99% of emotions. And that tears are words of the heart, that our mouths can't utter. But to go back to the story, that we just read, when these 2 men cried, they released what was in their hearts. It was an outpouring of their desperation. And that's what changed their lives, when they cried out. But it's not just the fact that they cried out, but to whom they cried out. That's what changed the course of their life. So I'll go more into that. But let me highlight some of the things around the story through the lens of their cry. Okay? A few things. Number 1, the reason for their cry. What was the reason for their cry? In verse 30, it says, "Behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside." So straight away we are told about their problem. They are blind. And we don't know what caused the blindness. We don't know why, or when they started being blind. Was it by birth or was it later on? But we do know that was their crisis. That was their point of need. We are not even told about their names, in this version of the story. But the same story is also recorded in Mark's gospel, in which a name is mentioned. One of them. His name is Bartimaeus, Mark's gospel. So we don't know a lot about them. But we also see in verse 30 that they were sitting by the roadside. And that tells us a lot more than their blindness. You see, blindness, in their time, it was not just a physical problem to them, but it was also a social burden to them. Because in their society, because of, their physical limitation, they were isolated by everyone in that locality. So they didn't have any regular work that they could acquire. So they had to depend on the charity of people. And they were forced to, therefore, beg for survival. And they had no value socially. And People did not see them as individuals. People always saw them as, as unimportant, neglected. So that was the harsh, reality that they found themselves in. And that filled them with, shame, more than the blindness that they had. But what we see in the story is that when they cried out, they were not just expressing the crisis, concerning their blindness, but they were also expressing their deep anguish, of years of suffering, years of being isolated, years of, feeling shame from the people around them. That's the wholesome of what they were expressing to Jesus when they cried out. That's the reason, for their cry. Second, the intensity of their cry. The intensity of their cry. The word, cried, that's used there, it doesn't just mean, to sob. It doesn't just mean to shed tears. But the word there actually means to shout or to scream. They were screaming and shouting at Jesus. That's how they expressed their heart. Why were they loud? Well, one reason is that they were so desperate, terribly desperate. And also because they had heard about Jesus. They had heard about all the miracles that, he's been performing, in that place. And so because in that place and time, there was no means of medical treatment or medical aid, somehow in their minds they realized if they had any hope of healing, this was it. If they had any chance of finding a new life, it would be through Jesus. And so they want to give it their all. And so they cry out really loud. And also because they knew that their only hope was right within their reach as Jesus was passing along. So this is their chance to, seize the opportunity. And not only that, their voices had to rise above the noise of the crowd. Because it's always crowded, when Jesus is there. Because he's healing people and there's always a big crowd following. And not only that, their voice also has to rise above the crowd that's rebuking them, telling them to be silent as well. So the intensity of their cry was very strong. Primarily because they were so desperate, And so we see in the story an encounter between, desperate people and Jesus. The third thing is the reaction to their cry. The reaction to their cry. In verse 31, it says that the crowd rebuked them and warned them and told them to be quiet. But then they cried out all the more. The crowd told them they should be quiet. Maybe they said, stop bothering Jesus. He has important things to do. And the crowd said, Jesus is not available to you. There are other people he needs to attend to. I don't know how they rebuked the blind men. But the crowd tried to silence them, tried to keep them quiet. And one of the hardest realities in life is, the feeling that nobody hears, right? Nobody hears your cry. And they've sensed that all their life. They've sensed that nobody is there to hear their cry. And even now, when they're coming to Jesus, there is a crowd that's trying to silence them. So it shows us that we actually live in a world that is indifferent, to our cries, to the cries of the heart. Because we often feel like, in a world filled with noise, our cries are actually lost, in the void. It's lost in the void. And it can feel as though our cries are unimportant. And that's how these two blind men always felt. But look at the courage and the resilience of the two blind men, because they didn't back down. When they were told to shut up, it says they shouted all the more. That's really nice. So that was a reaction to their cry. We also see the focus of their cry, to whom they directed the cry. In verse 30, they cried out, they shouted, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. The focus of their cry was Jesus. And that's what made the difference. That's what made the difference. There were a lot of people who were suffering, in their time. A lot of people there around. And they all had sorrows, and, they all had, they would all cry, because of their own personal crisis. But here, what made the difference is not just that they expressed, their sorrow by crying out, but the fact that they expressed it to the right person. What made the difference is that, not that they cried, but they cried to the one who has all authority over every problem, over every peril. That's what made the difference. They cried out to the right person. And the same thing is also true of our lives. It matters to whom we cry. It makes a difference to whom we express what's in our heart. And that's what, changed their story. Let me tell you something interesting. The American Psychological Association did a study in 2011, and they published something in a journal called The Research in Personality. And you know what they said? Let me quote that for you. They said, when you cry, who sees you cry makes a difference. When you cry, who sees you cry? Who's watching you cry? That makes a difference. And they're saying it makes a difference in whether the crying will help you or hurt you. And they said people who cry felt worse if they felt embarrassed or ashamed of crying in front of unsupportive people. They're saying crying can make you feel worse if you cry in front of the wrong people. They're saying that crying, can hurt you in a sense because you're not only expressing the sadness of your heart, but you're also now bearing the weight of the embarrassment that you may sense, by the people who are watching you cry. That's a very fascinating study. And I see how that can relate to the story, because when these two blind men cried out to Jesus, we don't sense any embarrassment. We don't sense any form of inferiority that they felt. We don't see them feeling embarrassed, to express so loudly, the sorrows of their heart. And that says something about Jesus, It says something about the power of crying to Jesus. It shows us that Jesus, is the safest person that you can cry to. It shows us that there is a freedom that comes with Jesus that you can't find with anyone else. There is a freedom that Jesus brings for you to express your emotions, that you can't find that kind of freedom, that kind of security with anyone else. Only Jesus brings that freedom. And so these two men, they were loud, they were unashamed, unembarrassed to cry because they cried to Jesus. The focus of their cry was Jesus. And they could sense the purity of his compassion for them. There is a safety. There is a security with Jesus. A security that you and I can't find anywhere else. Because with Jesus, you have the fullest security and the freedom to express yourself. And that's what made the difference for them. So now that they have expressed, their heart to Jesus, they've cried out to Jesus, how did Jesus respond? What did Jesus do? First, there is a response from Jesus. First of all, Jesus responds. Verse 32, it says, Jesus stopped and called them. I see that to be the turning point in the story. Jesus stopped. It's a special thing when Jesus stops. Because when Jesus, being a person who's always on the move, in the stories we read, he's always on the move. He's always healing people and, moving from one place to another. But, in that a journey, all of a sudden he stops. And when Jesus stops, the crowd stops as well. And so Jesus stops, the crowd stops, but more than that, heaven stops. When Jesus stops, heaven stops too. And all the resources of heaven, are at his disposal. So it's a very profound moment that Jesus stopped for their cry. And every, time Jesus stopped, when he heard somebody cry, there was something amazing that happened. And we see the same thing here. So Jesus stopped. Now, why did Jesus stop? Let me just point out, a very important difference between the crowd and the Jesus. You see, everybody heard the cry. Everybody heard the cry, right? The crowd heard the cry because they were loud. But Jesus not only heard the cry, he also listened to the cry. Do you know there's a difference between hearing and listening? For the crowd, the cry was just sounds. It was noise. But for Jesus, he not only heard it, he listened. He listened to the cry. Most of the people, they can only see the surface, right? They can only see the outward, distress or the visible tears. People can only see the surface, right? But Jesus sees beyond the surface. And so, as the crowd heard, the cry, Jesus not only heard it, he saw beyond the surface. He listened to the cry. And so when he listened to the cry, he saw the person behind the pain. He not only sees the pain, but he sees the person behind the pain, and he understands not just the need in the moment, not just their need, for the blindness to be healed. He saw more than that. He saw their entire journey of life that led up to that moment. Jesus saw all the moments of desperation, all the moments of loneliness, all the moments of darkness that they experienced. He looked past, the surface of the cry, and what Jesus saw was their story. Jesus saw their story. He saw their silent battles, the moments of brokenness that nobody else would have noticed before. And he knew every chapter in their story and all the times, that they cried. And Jesus looked beyond the surface and listened to the cry of their heart. When Jesus stops and when he listens, he sees it all. He lovingly sees the whole of who we are. And here's another interesting detail, which is not found in this version of the gospel, this version of the story, but you find the same story in Mark's gospel, where, there is an interesting detail. It is in Mark 10:49, where Jesus tells them, the first thing, one of the first things that Jesus tells them is take heart. Jesus tells them, take heart. Very special words. We hear them in a very ordinary way. But for those blind men, those two words were so special. Take heart. Because it is the first time someone has spoken kindly to them. First time, perhaps. And it was Jesus. And so with those two words, Jesus begins to weave hope into their hearts. There's a story I read about a man called Douglas, true story, who was starting to have high fever, and he was having some symptoms, of unhealth in his body. And so he went to a doctor, and he got the diagnosis, and turned out to be cancer. And it came as a shock, to him. And over the next few weeks, he was just getting an overload of information, about the treatment that he has to undergo and all the different symptoms that he will have to face, such as losing, the hair and, all the pain that he might have to, endure in that process. And so it was just an overload of, this information. And also doctor, warning him that he might not make it, the treatment might not be successful. And so all he's hearing for these few weeks is just this overload of discouraging and frightening information. But in the midst of that, his aunt sends him flowers and sends him a card. And the card, didn't say a lot. The card said something like this. The card said something like, Douglas, I had cancer too when I was 7. And I survived it. You're going to be just fine. And for the first time, in those few weeks, for the first time, he heard encouraging words. And those few words on that card gave him the courage to go through that process. Because he looked to her as an example that there is a way to survive this. And those few words on the card gave him the courage to survive the process. And soon enough, he survived. He survived. See how it makes a difference, to say words to lift people up. And for the first time, the two blind men heard words that lifted them up. When Jesus said, take heart, take heart. That was the moment, their heart was filled with hope. They could see that, hope is on the horizon. And they could expect that things are going to turn out well for them. So that's how Jesus deals with us too. So while the crowd rebuked, the blind men, Jesus lovingly responded to the blind man. So first thing, there's a response from Jesus. When we cry, there's a response from Jesus. He doesn't turn a deaf ear to us. He never turns a deaf ear. When we cry, he stops. He stops. And when he stops, the whole of heaven stops. Second, there's a question from Jesus. It's a question from Jesus. Verse 32. He says, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Now, when you read that question, it looks very, it's just a plain reading of the story. But think about it. It's a very obvious question, And maybe the people thought, Lord, why would you ask that question? Isn't it obvious? Two blind men. You know what they need? They want their eyes to be opened. It's an obvious question. And it's always funny when, you get obvious questions, right? I mean, imagine you're having a meal and somebody's like, you eating? And you're like, what else do you think I'm doing, All these questions are funny. And we all ask such questions. But that's not what Jesus is doing here. Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? You know why? He wants them to name their need. Jesus wants them to be specific. And Jesus wants them to tell them their need. When they first come to Jesus, they say, Son of David, have mercy on me. Have mercy on us. But Jesus is saying, no. Tell me what you need. Tell me what you need. We often say, Lord, bless us. Bless us. And I think sometimes Jesus says, no, tell me what you need. He wants us to be specific. He wants us to be specific. He's not against generic prayers. I'm not saying we don't say, Lord, bless us, or say generic prayers. Of course not. But he wants us to be specific. He says, tell me, what do you want me to do for you? You know why Jesus wants us to be specific? Because that way he can show us that he listens to the details of our lives and the details of our thoughts and our hearts. And he wants us to be specific to strengthen our faith, because that's how we become aware of his involvement, in our lives. When we ask specific things and when he answers specifically to meet your needs, that's how you know he's involved in your life. When we pray specifically, we can recognize his hand at work in the little things and the big things. And it deepens our relationship with him. So we don't just thank him for the broad blessings, but we also thank him for the specific ways that he answers our prayers. And as I was thinking about this point, I thought of a PPT that we made as a church during our fasting and prayer, maybe 2 or 3 years back, I can't remember. And one of the prayer points mentioned was, Lord, we want to pray that you will bring wonderful families to our church. More wonderful families to our church. For your kingdom's sake. It's there on the PPT. I might be able to find it and show you. And Pastor and I, often talk about how God has answered that prayer. God has brought wonderful families, to our church. Specific prayer and a specific answer. It's really encouraging because, God shows us that he's involved in the details of our lives. Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? So I want to challenge you to make your prayers specific, and you'll be surprised how God works in your lives. Make it specific. So finally, they named their need. Verse 33, they said to him, Lord, here's what we really need. We need our eyes, to be opened. So they asked for physical healing. So we saw that there was a response from Jesus and there was a question from Jesus. And now third, there is a condition from Jesus. Verse 32, he says, do you believe that I can do this? What is he asking for? He's asking for faith. But keep in mind, they already had faith in Jesus in a sense, because what did they call Jesus? What was the title they gave to Jesus? If you follow the story. Son of David. Son of David. That's how they called him. And in that context, for the Jewish people, the Son of David is a title given to the Messiah. It's given to the Messiah. So these two blind men saw Jesus as the Messiah. So here's the irony. There were so many people who could see Jesus physically with their eyes, but they didn't see him for who he truly was. They didn't see him as the Messiah. But these two blind men, though they were physically blind, they saw Jesus for who he truly was. They saw him as the Messiah. So they already came to Jesus with faith. But how did they respond in faith? Verse 33, they said to him, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. That was their response of faith. To just put it simply, faith is simply saying, yes, Lord. Simply saying, yes, Lord. You can do it. I know you can do it. I know you have the power to do it. Yes, Lord. Faith is often complicated by, many teachings in the church. But we see here in the story, faith is simply expressed in those two words. Jesus asked, do you believe I can do this? Yes, Lord. They said it from their heart. Yes, I believe you can do it. That's faith. I like that response. Faith is saying, yes, Lord. And in another version of the story, Jesus tells them, according to your faith, let it be done to you. It's a condition from Jesus. He always keeps faith as a condition. So we see the two blind men coming to Jesus, having an encounter with Jesus. But what's really important to see is that they met the condition of Jesus, which is, faith. And though there were so many people who couldn't see Jesus for who they truly was, these two blind men, though they couldn't physically see, they saw Jesus and his true identity in their heart. They saw that this is the Messiah. That raises the question, who is truly blind? Who's truly blind? So faith is a requirement from Jesus. And when they cried, things turned in their favor. And it was not just an ordinary cry. I'm not trying to say that there is some kind of power in, crying or, in the expression of crying. But I'm trying to show that it was a cry of faith. It was a cry of faith. Faith was the basis of their cry. They said, Lord, only you can. Only you can. So that's the third thing. It's a condition from Jesus. Okay. Last, there is a remedy from Jesus. Matthew 20, verse 34, it says, Jesus had compassion on them, touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight, and they followed him. How did the healing happen? He placed his hands on their eyes. He simply touched their eyes. We need Jesus, to touch our problems, right? We need Jesus to place his hands on our problems. That's what brings the remedy. And so they received the healing they needed. They received the sight that they needed. And it was a remedy that only Jesus could bring. I don't know what's your battle. I don't know, what's the thing that could be bothering you? What's the thing that has come as a crisis in your life? But whatever it is, what the story shows us is that when you express your heart to Jesus in faith, Jesus will bring a remedy. He'll bring a remedy. And it may not be the remedy that we expect in a certain way, but it'll be a remedy of his choosing sometimes. And he knows what we need, and he knows what we best need. And we can trust him to bring the remedy that we need. And so we see here, in the story that when these two blind men came to Jesus, they had an encounter with Jesus and they received, what they needed. But beyond that, it says, Jesus in verse 34 had compassion on them. They not only saw the display of his power, Jesus' power, but they also saw the character of Jesus. There's a story I read about a ship, which was caught in a storm. And in fact, it was heading into a zone that was quite dangerous, for the ship. And people began to panic, and the passengers, were so threatened. But there was one passenger who had the courage, to get up and, to run to the deck and to, just check with the pilot on what's happening. And so there was one passenger who ran to the deck and saw the captain. The captain was steering the, wheel. And inch by inch, he was slowly turning the ship in the right direction. And then the pilot simply turned around and saw the passenger who was standing there and didn't say much. All the pilot did was just smile. He just looked at the passenger and he smiled. And then the passenger went back, to the other passengers, and he gave out a note of cheer. He said, I saw the face of the pilot, and he smiled. All is well. All is well. I say that story, because these two blind men, they not only saw the power of Jesus, they not only saw the work of his hands, but they saw his face. They saw his face. And it says Jesus had compassion on them. They saw eyes of compassion. They not only saw his hands, but they saw his face. They saw his character. And for the first time, they saw eyes of compassion. They saw eyes of love, which they had never seen before. And so when their eyes were opened, the first thing they see is the face of Jesus. Face of love, the eyes of love, eyes of compassion. That's what they saw. And they realized all is going to be well. And it says from that point on, they began to follow Jesus. They began to follow Jesus. Sometimes we wonder, God, are you really listening, to the details of my life? Are you really concerned about, the crisis I have, in my life? It's a question that we, ask. Sometimes, as we read the stories of Jesus, we need to really understand, how Jesus feels about each one of us. We need to know how he feels towards each one of us. And what's really going to change our life is not a miracle that he may do for us, but the knowledge of Jesus, knowing who he is and knowing the glory of Jesus. That's what's going to really change, our lives for the better. Yesterday at Solid Ground, it was our first Solid Ground of this year. And we wanted to start with a cross. And we started with a cross. And we asked, our youth, how do you live a holy life? How do you break free from sin? And how do you overcome sin? How do you do all of that? We all know the answer. We all know we have to pray. We have to read the Bible. But then the question is, but what if I don't feel like praying? What if I don't feel like reading the Bible? It's a challenge we can all relate to, right? What if I don't feel motivated to do that? And so yesterday the message, we focused on the fact that it's the cross. It's always the cross that motivates us, to love him. We can love him because he first loved us. So when our hearts grow dull, all we need to do is remember the cross of Christ, because it's only the cross where we can see how much he loved us, and let that motivate us, to live the kind of life that he wants us to live. It's his love that helps us love him back. I just close with this poem. I love poems. A poem by Olga Wise, which beautifully captures the power of crying to Christ. And it's a conversation, a little conversation between, the person and Christ. So here's how it goes. The road is too tough, I said. Dear Lord, there are stones that hurt me so. And the Lord said, dear child, I understand. I walked it long ago. But there's a cool green path, I said. Let me walk there for a time. No, child, he gently answered me. The green path does not climb. My burden, I said, is far too great. How can I bear it so? My child, he said, I remember the weight. I carried my cross, as you know. But I said, I wish there were friends with me who would make my way their own. Oh, yes, the Lord said. Gethsemane was hard to bear alone. And so I climbed the stony path, content at last to know that where my master had not gone, I would not need to go. And strangely then, I found new friends. The burden grew less so, and I remember long ago that he went that way before. The poem ends there. Olga J. Wise. There's no crisis, that you can face that Jesus hasn't faced himself and that Jesus cannot understand. That's why it says, Jesus went that way before. He went that way before. So I just want to encourage you this morning from this gospel, the word of God, that even your tears are prayers. Even your tears are prayers. And in fact, more than words, our tears travel faster to heaven. And Jesus is always ready to dry our tears. And we have a Savior who stops to listen. Not just to the words, not just to the cry, but listens to the details and the story of our lives. And he listens and he brings the remedy that he best thinks we need. Can we close our eyes and pray?